Hi everyone, this is lecture 1 for week 2, and in today's lecture we're going to look at the first creation account. There are 2 in Genesis 1. Now, like the other lecture videos, for most of this you can just listen to it as an audio. There will be 2 slides that I will show, and I'll try to kind of call out and say slide so you can turn back to looking at the video if you want to hear it just as an audio. Again, also a warning that I will again be using the male pronoun for God in this class, and of course in this lecture, and this is because for the most part God is portrayed as a he, as a male. Okay, so we're going to start with Genesis 1, and this story, the story of creation, in Genesis 1, as well as the second story of creation, which is found in starting at Genesis 2:4. This is part of what is called the primeval history or the primeval narrative. And the primeval history or the primeval narrative run from Genesis 1 through 11. Okay, and it contains this kind of segment of the stories, contains stories about beginnings and sort of cosmic origins. Okay, now we call the book that we're going to begin with Genesis, but in the Jewish tradition, there's a slightly different way of naming the books, and the books are called by the first word in that book. So the name for the book of Genesis in the Jewish tradition is Bereshit. Okay, and this is because the first word that Genesis begins with is Bereshit. And it goes, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashemayim ve'et haaretz, right? And this is translated. I'm going to give you my translation and tell you a little bit about the various translations you'll hit. So when Bereshit, when God began creating the heavens and the earth, okay, so this is how I would translate it. If you have different Bibles, you're going to find slightly different translations. So for example, the NIV has, and this is the older, I want to say more classical translation, though as I will explain in a minute, the more inaccurate translation. Okay, so the NIV has, in the beginning, comma, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, the NRSV, which I think is what most of you guys are using, has something kind of in the middle. Okay, in the beginning, God, when God created the heavens and the earth. Okay. And the reason why you're getting these various translations has to do with the first word, this Bereshit. Okay. This word does not appear very frequently in the Hebrew text, about 5 times, okay? And the way that Hebrew works, or the way that we know the meaning of a particular Hebrew word, okay, is via comparison. So you compare it to maybe other related texts from the ancient Near East and a related language and see how that word is used in those texts. But the best way to figure out what a word means is to look at the way that is used in the Hebrew text. So what this means is that the less frequently a word is used, the more undecipherable the meaning, the connotation of that word is, okay? And 5 times really is not that many, okay? So this is a kind of fancy way of saying we don't really know what Bereshit is, though we can kind of get close to figuring it out, okay? Bereshit seems to be composed of a preposition plus a kind of noun, okay? And it begins with this preposition ba, okay, which if you are taking Hebrew, you'll learn means in or at or with. If you've studied other languages, you'll realize that prepositions are some of the trickiest things to translate, because a lot of it is the way that language sounds, whether it sounds okay, whether it's not sound okay. So prepositions are very, very difficult to go from one language to another, okay? So Bereshit begins with ba, this preposition, plus the word rosh, okay? And rosh means head or chief. For example, if you've heard of Rosh Hashanah, right, the Jewish New Year, rosh is part of that word. So Rosh Hashanah is at the head of the year or at the head of the turning. Okay, so you have in or with plus head or chief. Okay, and so putting all that together, the best translation is the way that I translate it and the way that JPS translates it, for example, when at the head of, okay, or when God began creating or started creating, okay, the best translation is this kind of dependent clause, okay. And there's a reason, you'll see why I'm going so long into the translation problems here, okay. So then the question is, well, why if when God began creating the heavens, if this is a better translation, why does, for example, the New King James or your NIV still have this older translation? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and doesn't make any difference at all, okay. So there's two reasons why this old translation remains. Okay, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the first reason is it is deliberately translated, though it's inaccurate, to mimic the beginning of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, He was with God in the beginning. Okay. I remember I won a Garfield t-shirt for memorizing John 1. When I was whatever, okay, so this translation of Genesis 1 as in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth is a deliberate mistranslation to mimic the beginning of the Gospel of John, and in so doing to formulate a connection between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Okay, so it's deliberate. Okay. Why? Because, of course, for early Christians and for the writers of the New Testament, they were trying to make this argument that they are a direct descendant of, perhaps a better version of the religion that comes out of the Hebrew Bible. Okay? So they need that connection. Okay? There's a second reason, again theological, why the beginning of Genesis has been mistranslated as in the beginning. And it has to do with what it seems to imply theologically. Okay? So when you say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, you are implying that there was nothing before that this is the beginning of everything, the beginning of time itself, okay, that there was nothing there, okay. And a fancy word for this creative act from nothing is called creation ex nihilo, okay. And let me put up a slide here. So creation ex nihilo, so creation from nothing. Okay. However, so think about that. In the beginning, okay, implies that there is nothing there before God begins this act of creation. Now compare that to this other translation, the more accurate translation. When God started creating the heavens and the earth, okay. Notice that this is merely a temporal, there's a slight difference with this translation. When God, you're only talking about when something started to happen. So for example, when I started baking chocolate cake or when I started petting my cat, okay? You're not implying in this second translation that there was nothing before. Rather, the cat or the ingredients for the cake exist before I start petting it or baking with the ingredients, okay? You're merely stating that there is a point in time when you started doing something, okay? That is, with the translation, when God began creating the heavens and the earth, the implication is that contra creation ex nihilo, something might have been there before, okay? Unlike creation ex nihilo, which implies that there was nothing there before, okay? And indeed, if you look at verse 2 of Genesis 1, okay, so if you move from the first verse, it tells you, the biblical text tells you what was there, that there was indeed something there before God began his creative act. Okay, so take a look at verse 2. Now the earth was formless and void, or formless and chaotic. And the Hebrew word here is vatohu vabohu. Okay, and these sounds mimic the formlessness. Okay, and darkness was over the face of the deep. or the watery chaos, or the abyss, or the ocean. Okay, there's also translation for this Hebrew word tahom. Okay, so what was there before or when God begins creating? Well, the text tells you, tohu vabohu, okay, formlessness and chaos, and toho, a deep abyss, a watery abyss, kind of a chaotic ocean. Okay, so what seems to be there before God begins creating is a dark, chaotic, disorderly, formless, unshaped, watery darkness. Okay. Now, the translators of the Bible also realize that there are slight variations in how in the translation, and that they have theological implication. Okay, and early translators in particular, but even the translators of the NIV, what they realize is that there is a deep problem that's created when you start implying that something existed before God's creative act. Okay, even though it's more textually supported. Okay, and in Dr. Rigsby's class, I think she'll talk about why creation ex nihilo is so important, though it's not supported in the biblical text. Okay, so what's the theological problem? Okay, so what's the problem with chaos or formlessness, which is what verse 2 tells you, existing before God begins creating? Well, in short, I'm kind of making it very succinct. It means that chaos or formlessness is pre-existent with God. Okay, it was not created by God. And if it was not created by God and coexistent or pre-existent alongside God, it implies that this thing, chaos and formlessness, might be on the same level as God, maybe even created by a bigger God at the same time. Okay, and if they're on the same level, formlessness and chaos and God, or the creative God, then it means that these two forces can counteract each other, or go to war, or oppose each other, however you want to think about it, and that they are equal in power. So God can actually lose, okay? Or they can go out to war, and God can be effectively countered by the chaos. Okay, and indeed, something like that does happen. Okay, a battle between gods who are similar in power. Okay, and the story of this kind of battle between the gods, one who represents this kind of creative God and one who represents a kind of oceanic, chaotic God. This is talked about in the older ancient Near Eastern myth from Babylonia. Babylonia is part of modern day Iraq. Okay, and it is the kingdom Babylon that conquers and exiles the Israelites, what's remaining of the Israelites. Okay, in the 6th century. Okay. So the Babylonians have their own myth about the creation of the universe. Okay, and a lot of scholars, I included, of course, think that the biblical writers of Genesis 1, okay, probably based their account of the creation of the universe on this older Babylonian myth. And this myth is called the Enuma Elish, okay? And in the Enuma Elish, a storm god named Marduk goes to war with the chaotic water ocean deitist goddess named Tiamat, and she symbolizes chaos, disorder, and also the waters, okay, this kind of oceanic waters. Okay? And after a lot of back and forth, and I included the Enuma Elish as part of your optional readings, Marduk wins. Okay, Marduk defeats Tiamat, okay, the ocean deitess, by throwing a thunderbolt down her throat, which splits her in two. And from her carcass, Marduk creates the world. Yeah. Scholars have long noticed how similar Enuma Elish sounds to Genesis 1. Okay, so for example, take the name of the water deitess that's the opponent of Marduk, Tiamat. Okay, notice how similar Tiamat sounds to the word tohu, bohu, and very, very similar to this word tahom, okay, which, as I translated it, means the deep or the oceanic chaos, or the abyss. Okay, and the similarities are more evident if you understand that Hebrew did not originally have vowels. Okay, the vowels in the text, the vowels are added in later by scribes between the 6th and 10th century. Okay, so it's all just consonants. Okay, and notice tahom, the sound t and m sounds very, very, very similar to the t, m, tiamat sound. Okay. And just like Enuma Elish, okay, the Genesis account, what seems to be around when God begins his creative act is this watery chaos. Okay, and in the Enuma Elish, Tiamat is in some ways a more ancient deity than Marduk. Okay, notice also how, like in the Enuma Elish, God is envisioned like Marduk as a storm deity. Marduk is a storm god, a kind of rainstorm god. Okay, and you can tell that God is imagined as a storm god at the end of verse 2. Okay, you see this at the end of Genesis 1:2. Okay, where it says, "And a wind." This is the word ruach, a wind, a spirit. But actually, you can actually translate it slightly differently. A whirlwind, a storm, okay, a windstorm, okay, of God was trembling or quaking over the face of the waters. Okay, this is my own translation of verse 2. God, in other words, depending on the translation, and the translators will hide a lot of this from you, God, as I translated it in verse 2, is imagined like Marduk as a kind of storm cloud or storm wind, okay, raging or quaking, possibly getting ready to battle, but the battle's gone, or the battle's not there anymore, over the face of the waters of the deep, okay, which again sounds very or looks very much like this ancient goddess Tiamat, okay. This vision of God or Yahweh as a storm god is found all over the biblical text. It's one of the predominant visions of this deity in the biblical text. So, for example, you can look at Psalm 18. Okay. Not only that, but it is very frequent in the biblical text to imagine the opponent of God, who is imagined as a storm god. Okay. To imagine God's opponent as a water or the ocean, okay, or chaos. And all of that is kind of one idea system, okay. This is why frequently you'll find in the biblical text famous Israelites, Moses, Elijah, Joshua, even Jesus later, this is coming out of the same idea system, either walking across water, splitting water, defeating water metaphorically, and it's because of this old idea that water is the opposite, the opponent of God. Okay. Now, you have to be really careful. Water is an opponent of God, but in the Hebrew text, water does not necessarily have a moral force. Okay, water is merely the opponent. It is not evil, or the ocean is merely opponent. It's not evil. Okay, rather, it's just the thing that's imagined. Chaos, the ocean, the deep, is merely imagined as something that kind of stands against God. Okay, but neither of them are good and evil. There's not quite that idea yet. Okay, it's merely the kind of yin to the yang, the thing that kind of balances it, opposes each other. Okay. Now, the water, the chaos, that was the opponent of God, was imagined also as a animal representative. God, the storm god, will also be imagined as an animal representative. And the animal representative of the waters or the chaos was a serpent or a snake, sometimes called in the biblical text the Leviathan or the Rahab. Okay. And so you may ask, well, why was the chaos or the watery deep imagined as a serpent or a snake? Well, think about what the waves of the ocean look like. Okay. Think also about how the ocean might have seemed, well, still seems, to the Israelites who were not, unlike the Greeks, they were not seafaring. Okay, think about how scary the ocean looked or was. Okay, bad things came from the ocean, be it invading armies. Okay, or maybe points to flood, which we'll get to in a bit. There's still monsters in the ocean. You can look at a slideshow, modern slideshow, of where they take cameras now down to the deep oceans, and there are indeed monsters down there. So the ocean was seen as a truly chaotic, mysterious, deep, terrifying, almost monstrous thing, but a necessity. Okay. So so that's, and it was imagined because of its waves as a serpent or a snake. Okay. Now, like I said, in the biblical text, this kind of opponent of God, this chaotic, watery opponent of God, does not have a moral force. Eventually, it will come to have a moral force. Okay, especially after the development of monotheism. So despite our desires to read monotheism into the text, remember that this text is a composite, comes from various different periods, and monotheism should not necessarily be assumed. Okay. So once that happens, the water, this opponent of God, takes on a kind of moral force, okay, and comes to represent evil, as well as, evil kind of turned into a being, the devil or Satan. Okay, but notice how some of this watery imagery lingers in our vision of Satan or the devil. Okay, notice that Satan in post-biblical texts has, is imagined, or post-biblical imagination has a pitchfork and a split tail. Okay, well, the split tail is probably this kind of serpent dragon imagery. Okay, this kind of animal symbol of the chaos, oceanic chaos. Notice that the pitchfork is really the trident of Poseidon, who is the god of water. Okay, so our ideas of the devil or this kind of evil opponent of God really goes back far into this kind of original idea of what the waters represent, or who the original opponent of God was, except of course with a huge infusion of moral force into it. Okay. As a side note, notice how similar Zeus, the storm god, is to Baal, of course, but a god in the Hebrew Bible. Okay. Okay, now going onwards. In the Hebrew Bible, yet you don't have this moral force. Instead, you just have water being a mere opponent, the other side of God. Okay. Now, it is only by realizing that Genesis 1 is a kind of riff or modern redoing, I guess, of an older ancient Near Eastern story, the Enuma Elish, and probably others similar to it, that we can understand what creation really means in Genesis 1. Okay, and the word that is translated as create, okay, in the beginning, when God created, this word, okay, or when God began creating, this word is bara, and it is impossible to translate. Okay, and the reason is because this seems to be an activity, bara, that only God does. So humans do not ever bara anything in the Hebrew Bible. This is a very divine act, okay? The problem is, if this is an activity that only God does, okay, we don't know how do we conceptualize that, okay? It seems to be something like create, but this is a divine only activity. How can humans understand what only the God or the gods can do? Okay, but okay, so it's translated as create, so let's go with that for a minute. Okay, so then the question shifts a little bit. Well, what does create then mean? What does bara mean? Okay, and you got to start now looking at the verses that follow. So verses 3 to 9, I might not read all of this. When God started creating the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind or a storm cloud from God raged over the face of the waters. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, And God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was evening, there was morning, the first day. Right? And this, of course, continues for many, many other days, okay, until the seventh day. Okay, notice what creation entails in the biblical text. It includes separating, okay, and as I'll show in a minute, ordering. Okay, notice how he keeps separating things out, okay, to their appropriate place. Okay, and indeed, there's more of an order than mere separation. Okay, so separation seems to be a huge component of God's creation in Genesis 1, not just separating, but also ordering. Okay, notice how on days 1, 2, and 3, okay, you have the creation of day and night, heaven and oceans, earth and seas, day 1, day 2, day 3. Notice how these are the creation of large containers, and how on the subsequent days, days 4, days 5, day 6, the objects that go into the containers are created. Okay, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. I'm going to put up a slide. Okay? So take a look at the days of creation. This is the P account. Okay, so day 1, as I said, day and night are created. Day 2, oceans, heavens and the oceans are created. Day 3, earth and seas are created. And now look at how what's created afterwards are the things that go into the larger containers. Day 4, the sun, moon, and stars, which go into the day and the night. Okay, day 5, the birds and the sea creatures, which goes into the larger containers of the heavens and the ocean. Okay, and then in day 6, cattle, earth creatures, and humans, which go into or fit in the larger container of earth and the seas. And of course, this is all sort of climactically sort of topped by the Sabbath. Okay, so creation, therefore, seems to be imagined in a very particular way. It is ordering, structuring, taking the chaos, moving things out of it so that you can create order, space in the midst of it. Okay, so creation in the biblical text is not, we think of it as sort of, I Dream of Jeannie, where you like blink and things appear. Rather, the evidence, at least the textual evidence, seems to indicate that that's not what creation is. Okay, instead, it is much more similar to kind of early Marie Kondo, okay, where you start cleaning up the space. So you have a watery chaos that's pre-existent, and what God does when he creates is to start making spaces of order, okay, and giving it a kind of structure. Okay, and notice that the structure is not only evident in how creation unfolds, but also in the language that you of Genesis 1. And this is evident even in the English. Notice how ritualistic, almost liturgical people have said, and people have wondered whether this was used in liturgy. Okay. Notice how formulaic it sounds, let there be, and then, God called this, God called that, the first day, this repetition, formulaic, structured language. Okay. So then now we turn to the last question. Why does the biblical writers imagine creation this way? Okay, so what do they have at stake, the writers? Okay, why do they depict God as cleaning up the space, this chaos? Okay, now to this you got to kind of think about the documentary hypothesis and who are the writers of Genesis 1 might have been. And well, who was interested in order and structure, ritual, this was used liturgically. Well, of course, this is P, the priestly source, who was the last source, okay? And of course, if you are the last source, what are you gonna do? Let's say you have the text in front of you. Well, you're gonna put your story first so that all the stories that follow will be filtered through your lens, right? Which is what they did. So why did the P writer, this priestly writer, imagine God creating as an act of structuring and ordering? Right? Why do they imagine God as the God of order who opposes chaos and disorder so forcefully? Okay? And notice in Genesis 1 how much more powerful this God is okay, versus the God, let's say, of Enuma Elish. There is no battle here, okay? Rather, God is just a sort of unhindered, okay, able to create at will, able to separate chaos, okay, whenever he wants, just by his word, okay? So this is a very much more powerful deity that's imagined. Well, why would P imagine such a God? And again, the context of the P writers might give you some explanation, okay? Notice that that P is writing from after exile. So they're writing from a period of time when their country has been destroyed, their temple has been destroyed, a lot of them have been forced to go into another country, they've been exiled, okay? So really, P is living in a world of chaos, when things have really just upended themselves. And so, unsurprisingly, when P imagines a better world, right, P dreams of a world that is the opposite, calm, peaceful, order, right? A world ruled by and created by a deity who is the opposite of disorder, the opposite of chaos, okay? And of course, P, writing from this position of being exiled and having all their cultural artifacts being ruined, basically, of being uprooted, would imagine a God that is way more powerful, okay, who is deeply transcendent. Why? Because when you're weak, this is probably when you want God to be much more powerful, okay? Why? Because it is only that kind of God that has enough force and might to upend the world to make it right for you. Okay. This kind of ordered structure of Genesis 1 indeed might have two functions, okay? It at once describes and tells you what kind of writer the Israelite writers probably P wanted or desperately needed, okay? So it tells you the story about the writers and their intentions, okay? It may also act, like all good stories do, as a kind of incantation or a spell, a kind of prayer almost, a desperate wish of sorts, okay? You do get the sense, especially because of its liturgical ordered sensibilities, okay, that by reading aloud this structured story about an ordering God, creating via word a peaceful and structured world, right? Whether the writers in telling this story, and it would probably have been aloud, it would have been oral, whether they're almost trying to, like a magical spell, cause this kind of world, this ordered world, to come into being, right? So through the stories, they're trying to affect reality, to take this world of chaos or disorder and to transform it, right? To upturn it, to make it into a better world, a world of peace and order and calm, ruled by a God who perpetually acts to hold at bay this horror and chaos that is always threatening to kind of ensue and overwhelm. Like P's dreams, interestingly, are not that dissimilar from our dreams. We still imagine this kind of world. Right? Thank you. I will talk about the second story of creation in the next video.